Welcome to Flourish-Meant, the podcast on living life as you are meant to, so you can flourish. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have back with me today Dr. Craig von Buseck. He is the managing editor for inspiration.org. He's also an award-winning multi-published author and speaker across the United States and overseas. He's here to talk to us today about the leadership principles of Ulysses S. Grant in his new book for leadership called Forward. Welcome back, Craig.
Well, thank you, Tina. It's always an honor to be with you.
And I appreciate what you're doing to help leaders become their best by looking back at the past as well as moving forward. Tell us what makes you feel that the past gives us the keys to moving forward.
I often will talk at writers' conferences about why I have chosen to do true stories. And for me, one of the major reasons is that it's hard to argue with history, at least when you have proper historical information and you are confident in what the story is, then it is what it is. And so there are so many times in history where it seems like someone may be between a hard place and a rock, and there seems to be no way out. And yet somehow, by the grace of God and by God's intervention, he will deliver. He will give special provision. He will show up. He will block the hand of the enemy. And so for me, I think that is one of the major reasons. But I also would go back to the words of Mark Twain. And I think his words speak directly to what's happening in our world today, when he said, history does not repeat itself, but history rhymes. And I think the point being that we never see exactly the same thing happening, but man, do we ever see parallels. And today we are seeing so many parallels to several different places in history, but one of the key places is the American Civil War. Because so many of the things that they argued over and they fought over, in particular race-based slavery and racism itself, we are still arguing about and fighting over to this day. And I think that in order for us to heal from some of those things, in order for us to have reconciliation, I think we need to understand what happened then and then help to apply those lessons to our lives today.
Those are really good points. And I love that idea of making sure you can identify where history is rhyming today. We have so much crisis that we're facing right now. It does feel to some people as though we're facing a tearing apart in our country. So it's interesting that you point that toward the Civil War and that your book right now is about a Civil War leader who chose to find ways to move forward in impossible circumstances. Tell us who can benefit from the leadership principles that show us how to move forward. Do you have to be the CEO of an organization to really get benefit from learning from this?
No, anyone can learn from the lessons from the book that we're discussing, which is called Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was a common man. And that's one of the things that I bring across towards the end of the book, is that in the Civil War, there was a handing off of the baton between the more aristocratic founders of our country and the more common democratic people that would move forward from that point. Now, obviously, there's always been an aristocratic element, and there are the class distinctions in America, just like there are in every country. But what we saw there at Appomattox was General Robert E. Lee, the son of Light Horse Harry Lee, who was one of George Washington's top lieutenants in the Revolutionary War. He came to the place of surrender there in Appomattox Courthouse area, dressed in his best uniform. And he had attached to his side a gilded sword, beautiful sword. And this was his last, best, clean uniform that he carried with him to make sure that he had a clean uniform if he ever needed one. And he sat very erect, very prim, very proper. And then into that house of Wilmer McLean, who gave his house for the ceremony of the signing of the surrender. Into that house marched Ulysses S. Grant, the son of a tanner from the shore of the Ohio River in Ohio, outside of Cincinnati. And Grant had been riding his horse following the Army of Northern Virginia. And so Grant did not have a sword. He had a mud spattered uniform because he had been going through it was springtime and the roads were all muddy. And so he didn't have time to go back to find his uniform. In fact, he didn't know where it was. It was so far behind them that he only had this mud spattered uniform, these dirty, muddy boots, no sword. And he walked into that room and he said the only thing he could think of was being embarrassed that he didn't have a sword and a clean uniform. And he felt like he didn't want to offend Robert E. Lee. But I think it was incredibly appropriate that this general who was the son of a blue collar worker, and his father had worked his way up to where he had become successful, but Grant was just a person from out in the prairie, so to speak. And he came up to receive the surrender of the son of one of George Washington's lieutenants. And I think there was great symbolism there. And that is something that we can extend to any person. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what your education is. We can all learn from this humble leader, Ulysses S. Grant, because many of the decisions that he made, many of the leadership principles that he learned from his Methodist mother and from West Point and from just observation in life can really be applied to any person at any time in any place.
Yes, you talk about service and you talk about healing and humility and all of these things that some people may not include in their idea of leadership. Can you focus on a few of those principles that you think are some of the keys to moving forward in today's climate?
Absolutely. Leadership studies and those who are academics and researchers in the area of leadership have uncovered in the last 70 years not only observation, but they've been able to quantify the fact that servant leadership is the most effective form of leadership. Before World War II, leadership was looked on as very top down, very much I'm in charge and you're going to do what I say, barking orders, not having a lot of empathy or sympathy, and just kind of saying, well, I'm the smart one, so do what I say. There's an interesting movie from the 1990s, and I was in my master's program at Regent University doing a joint degree of divinity and journalism. And in the journalism school, we had a class called Communication Theory and Worldview. And one of the assignments was to take a current movie and to pull from that some communication theories and then give a report. And so I used the movie Crimson Tide, which starred Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington. Gene Hackman was the captain of a nuclear submarine facing possible nuclear war with Russia. And Denzel Washington was his CO, his second in command. And so there is this big battle between them. Well, Gene Hackman takes very much a pre-World War II position, whereas Denzel Washington takes a servant leadership. Also, for those who know about leadership theory, it was the Deming model of leadership, where you gather people together, you create teams, you pull from different people their expertise. And yes, there is a final person who makes a decision, but that decision is made amongst a community. Well, Ulysses S. Grant was carrying out that type of leadership 130 years before that movie ever came out, probably 80 years before Deming came out with his theories that revolutionized the Japanese economy after World War II. And one of the reasons that the Japanese became so successful in their manufacturing, their electronics, and so forth, and why so many people buy Toyotas and Hondas today is because they followed the Deming model and it just works. The servant leadership model of people like Ken Blanchard and others, it's very much a biblical model. It's very much based on the teaching of Jesus. But what leadership academics and researchers have found is that it works in the real world and it can be quantified. And so these are things that I show in this book, Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant, to say, listen, it's not just history that we're talking about here, but I married together the current leadership research with Grant's principles and his activities and his decisions to show that one of the reasons that Grant was successful is that even though he didn't know what these leadership principles were and they hadn't been identified by researchers in the 1860s, they work today just like they worked then and just like they always have worked, because they are based, I believe, in God's truth, and that is revealed in biblical principles.
Can these leadership principles help leaders move past the current economic, financial, and circumstantial crises that they're facing at this time in history? And how can they do that?
There are certain laws that I believe God has placed into the world that are just as true as the natural laws. So we know, for example, that gravity is a law that will always work. We know that the law of thrust and aerodynamics and thermodynamics, these laws always work. We have tested them for decades and centuries, and we know that they will always work. Well, I believe that there are also spiritual laws that work just as well. And one of those spiritual laws is the law of humility. You know, the Bible says that those who will humble themselves will be exalted. It doesn't say might be, it says they will be exalted. Another law, a couple other laws that I have seen over the years that I've seen work again and again. It doesn't really matter what your present circumstances are, but if you will employ these laws, eventually you will be pulled out of those circumstances. So, for example, one of those laws is the law of use. We see this very clearly physically in those who will exercise. If you are lifting weights, for example, you begin lifting weights and it may seem painful and difficult, but if you stay with it, eventually what happens is your muscles literally get torn and then they heal themselves. That's why it's painful when you're working out, but they heal themselves and they grow as they heal themselves. And so all of a sudden you have more muscle and it's much easier to lift those weights. So you add more weight and you go through the process again and again and again. And if you keep doing it, eventually you start out with 20 pounds and very soon you're lifting 200 pounds with the same amount of ease as you did with the 20 pounds because you stayed with it. So there is that law of use. And hand in hand with that is the law of perseverance. So not only do you use the muscle, and weightlifters and bodybuilders will say use it or lose it. And that is very true in the natural, but it's just as true in the spiritual. But also it's the perseverance to stay at it, to not quit, to even when it's painful, just keep going and keep pressing forward. And eventually these things will move in your life because they are God-given principles that always work. And the same thing I believe is true that we see in the life of Ulysses S. Grant in some of the things that he did. So for example, Grant was very much a democratic leader. And some people would say, how could you have a democratic leader in the military? Well, he was a Democratic leader who also understood that once he was able to gather the information from all of the experts that he surrounded himself with, then he was called upon to make the tough decisions. And that's where the military leadership clicks into play. Well, what has happened is that we've realized through research that this is actually the best way to make decisions, is to surround yourself with experts, to surround yourself with high quality, high character people, people who have a passion for whatever it is that you're doing, and to not just rely on your own ability or your own expertise, but to draw from the expertise of all these other people. And then in gathering all that information, then you can best make a decision to move forward. And that's what Grant would do. One of the other things that Grant had that was vitally important is just an understanding of strategic forward thinking. So he would always fight a battle in his head for weeks. Sometimes he didn't even have weeks, but when he did have weeks, he would fight the battle in his head for weeks, planning things out and looking at every possible way that that battle could work out. And then he would formulate the plan, and then he would give the orders to his commanders who would carry it out. And quite often, he would win these battles because he already had won the battle in his mind, and then he walked it out in the actual situation. So there are all kinds of examples of different leadership techniques and principles that Grant used. And if people will read this book and put some of these things to practice, it truly can make a revolutionary difference in your life as well.
And in the life of the country, if enough people apply this in our state that we're in right now, right?
Exactly.
So, do you have any personal experiences with having applied these principles? And would you like to share a story from that?
Absolutely. You know, we all go through times in life when we are thrown curveballs that we aren't expecting. I had a situation at one time in my life where I was a senior writer at a university. And just because of budget cuts and changes, I ended up getting laid off. And it was one of those times where I applied to more than 100 jobs, but no job was opening up. And so, because I had done a joint degree of divinity and journalism, I always was able to apply for jobs on both sides. And so, the job that did open up was as a hospital chaplain. And it was tough. It's hard work. Being a chaplain, you know, it's like being a firefighter. Everyone else is running out of the burning building and you're running into it. As a chaplain, you see most of the worst things that people experience in a hospital. And so it was very difficult. And I had moved many hours away from my three grown children. We were very close. And so I found myself in Tennessee all by myself with my dog, and I didn't know a soul. I didn't know anyone. And so I could have felt sorry for myself and sat every night after work and watched TV or movies or just played games or whatever. But I saw that this was actually an opportunity because I was in the midst of writing a book and I was doing my research at that time, a book on the rebirth of Israel and the part that President Harry Truman played in the rebirth of Israel. And so I had the opportunity, nights and weekends, to have just a ton of time available to me to do a deep dive into this research. And as a result, I was able to write this book called I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel. Well, that book went on to win last year the CELA Award for Nonfiction, which is the top Christian nonfiction award in the country. And it also was nominated by the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library for the Truman Award. It didn't win, but it was nominated. So had I just felt sorry for myself after being laid off from this job and finding a job that wasn't the one I really wanted and finding myself far away from my children, instead I said, okay, let's use what the advantage of this time is and keep pressing forward in what I believe God has called me to do. And as a result, you know, this book continues to have an impact and it continues to help, especially in times like right now, when the media is blaming Israel for terrorists who are firing rockets into their sovereign nation. And I shake my head and I say, just read my book, so that you can see what the truth of the situation is. So I would apply that and recommend that to anyone who's going through a difficult time, to use the jujitsu idea. When the enemy of your soul comes against you, use that energy to pull them past you and throw them to the ground.
Ooh, that's a really good image of using the enemy's energy to pull them past you and throw them to the ground. You can do that in places where you feel like you've failed, just as Ulysses S. Grant did, because he had a lot of situations that looked hopeless, that looked like they were insurmountable. And your principles show us how to move past those.
Yes, I think two areas, and they really were connected. Actually, three major circumstances that we talk about in the book, and they were all somewhat interconnected. First was Grant's alcoholism, and by giving into that alcoholism, he got pushed out of the army in 1853. And then, because of the reputation that he had created for himself as a drunk, when the Civil War broke out, at first, no one would hire him. Even though he was a West Point graduate, he was a captain, he was a hero of the Mexican War. And I mean, truly a hero. Some of the stuff he did in the Mexican War is, he risked his life not only to save his fellow soldiers, but to defeat the enemy. And yet, because of his reputation as an alcoholic, he was not allowed back into the army. But what he did was he recognized that he had made the mistake. And so he worked very diligently at whatever job was given to him, even though he wasn't given a commission as a colonel, which is what everyone else who had been the same rank as Grant immediately were given the commission as a colonel coming back into the Civil War. And so what happened is they needed officers who would muster the soldiers back into the army, the volunteers into the army, not back into, but into as volunteers. And so Grant said, well, I'll do that. It was way beneath his training and his experience, but it was the one opening that was there. And so he did it with excellence. And eventually word got back to the governor of Illinois that there was this officer, a captain, who had been just doing this excellent work. And anytime anyone, whether they were volunteers or officers who had already been in the military, anytime they had a question, Grant knew the answer. And so when word finally got back to Governor Yates that Grant was doing such a great job, the next opportunity that opened for a colonelcy, Yates appointed Grant to that, and the rest is history. Grant went shooting up through the ranks because now he had, for the most part, overcome his alcoholism. I have a whole chapter in forward about his alcoholic issues where you could get the details. But he was able to overcome that, and he went from working as a clerk in his father's leather goods store to being the lieutenant general in the course of 3 years over all the armies of the Union, and then 4 years later, president of the United States. There's much that we can learn from that lesson. Also from the lesson that he had to endure during the years after he was pushed out of the army, where he was a farmer in the midst of a Great Depression, and it was very difficult for him, but he continued to just do what was needed and press through. And then the final major issue and tragedy is the focus of my related book called Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant, where after he left the presidency, he went into business with his son. And sadly, they were business partners with a charlatan, someone who had no scruples. And his name was Ferdinand Ward. And Ward was running a huge Ponzi scheme the whole time. And after a couple of years, the business failed, leaving Grant penniless. Right after that, Grant is diagnosed with incurable throat cancer. And now he is very concerned about his wife. How is she going to live after he dies of cancer? And so he goes to work partnering with Mark Twain as his publisher to write his memoirs. He finishes the book 4 days before he dies. The book ends up making for Julia Grant $450,000, which in today's money would be more than $10 million. He restored his reputation. He took care of his wife and his family. And he also fought against the racial lost cause of the Confederacy. And so there's much that we can learn from him. He's truly, in my opinion, a hero and a role model for today and for all time.
It sounds as though, even though we might think they're at odds with one another, humility feeds into perseverance rather than pride. We tend to think of the people with grit as those who are proud, and yet those are the people who are most likely to give up when things get hard, aren't they?
I believe so. The Bible says it very clearly. Pride comes before a fall. And it's interesting, there were 6 commanders of the Army of the Potomac, which was the main army in the East Coast fighting around Richmond. 6 other commanders before them. Of those 6, 5 of them were very prideful people, very arrogant. They were not respectful of President Lincoln, and all 5 of them failed. The 6th commander was George Meade, and he actually won the Battle of Gettysburg. And when Grant was named lieutenant general over all the armies, he could have replaced Meade. But when he met with Meade, the very first thing that George Meade said to Grant was, I understand that there are people that you fought with out in the West that you knew from your training at West Point. And so if you want to replace me, I will step aside gladly and serve any role that you need me to, because the cause of winning this war, saving the Union and defeating slavery is more important than my position. Well, that totally impressed Ulysses S. Grant, and he kept George Meade in his position. And they ended up working, for the most part, very well together for the remainder of the war. And together, they helped to defeat Robert E. Lee. So I think that you look at Grant, you look at Meade, you also look at Abraham Lincoln. This was a man of unbelievable, it almost doesn't make sense, the humility that he had. So, for example, he placed a somewhat successful engineer and General McClellan, into the head of the Army of the Potomac. And the whole time that McClellan was the head of that army, he was very disrespectful of Lincoln. And there was one night when President Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward, were waiting in the home of McClellan to meet with him one night. And they waited and waited and waited. He was not there. And finally he showed up, and McClellan went directly upstairs, didn't say hello, and went to bed. And they waited another half hour. And finally the steward, the butler, came down and said to President Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward, I'm sorry, but General McClellan has gone to bed and he's not able to meet with you. Imagine that today. I mean, you can't even imagine that. And yet Lincoln didn't say a word. He left, and later someone said, why do you put up with McClellan's shenanigans? And Lincoln said this, he said, I would hold General McClellan's horse as long as he gives us victories. That's the kind of leader that is successful. That's the kind of leader that wins. Now, eventually Lincoln got fed up with McClellan, and McClellan wasn't winning. And so McClellan was replaced. That's the other side of leadership, is that being humble doesn't mean you're foolish. It doesn't mean you're a doormat. It means that you're willing to go a little bit of an extra step, and you're willing to recognize the gifts and abilities in other people that, when joined with your leadership, actually make you much stronger. And there's great wisdom in that.
So the cause is more important than my position. That is the key to why humility makes you persevere.
Absolutely. Absolutely correct. And, I think that there is a great lesson there for Christian leaders, especially. I am frankly shocked. I've been in ministry my whole life. My whole life. That's all I've ever done, other than when I worked jobs to get through school. So I've been in leadership. I've been in Christian ministry. I've been in media and so forth. And there's a lot of envy and strife and jockeying for position that goes on, even in Christian ministries, sometimes more than in secular ministries. And what is happening is those people are not looking at the cause, which is the Great Commission, which is to make Jesus known to the world and to make known what Jesus did for mankind in dying on the cross to pay for our sins. That's what our goal is. That's what our cause is. And yet people get caught up in building their own kingdoms, in their own reputation, in feeling sorry for themselves. And when they do that, their organization is not successful in moving forward the Great Commission. And I think that we all in Christian leadership, in Christian ministry, need to take the examples of Lincoln and Grant and Meade and say, let's keep our eye on the ball, which is shining the light to those who are lost in darkness.
Well, I'm confident that those listening cannot wait to delve deeper into each of these leadership principles that you've brought a little taste of today. How can people get in touch with you and find out more about moving forward with Forward, the leadership principles of Ulysses S. Grant?
They can order the book at grantforwardbook.com or at amazon.com or wherever books are sold. The book is available. If it's not on the shelf, ask your local bookstore to include it on the shelf and to give you a copy. They can order the book from the publisher. And then to find out more about my other books and my speaking and so forth, they can go to my website, which is just my last name, vonbuseck.com. That's very simply VONBUSECK.com, vonbuseck.com.
Thank you, Dr. von Buseck. I'm so glad that you came back to join us on Flourish-Meant today. And I hope that all of you listening will follow Dr. Craig von Buseck and get a copy of Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. And I also hope that you will come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant.